Okay, let's move on to some historical records. Some ancient Near Eastern text. For the Israelites, the stories of the Old Testament served a similar function. Yahweh was real to them, and his deeds were important. Like everyone else in the ancient world, the Israelites believed that everything that happened and everything that existed found its cause in deity. In this way of thinking, it is irrelevant whether the modern reader believes the gods of the Babylonians or the God of Israel exist. The significance and nature of the literature are not dependent on our assessment of their reality. These accounts serve as important sources for coming to understand the worldview of the ancient people. Original manuscripts written by the sacred authors themselves are no longer extant for any book of the Bible. The oldest partial copies of the text of any biblical book are to be found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. There are about 2,000 manuscripts of the Septuagint version of the Old Testament today. About 40% of the Dead Sea Scrolls contain the books of the Old Testament. 30% are copies of books which didn't make the cut for the Hebrew Bible, and another 30% are secular documents. The ancient Near East, until about a century ago, had as its chief witness the text of the Hebrew Bible. Relatively insignificant was the evidence recovered from sources outside the Bible. That which had been found had not been sufficiently understood to serve as a reliable historical source. Through explorations and excavations carried on within the last century in Egypt, Mesopotamia, Asia Minor, and Syria, a wealth of new information has become available. This new light from extra biblical text has served not only to enlarge immeasurably the horizon for a knowledge of the ancient Near East, but has also sharpened considerably the understanding of the content of the Bible itself. Some comparison with contemporary historical records. Since direct and specific historical evidence is rare and not realistically to be expected in many cases, this drastically limits the biblical text value as a historical source. Minimalists will even cast doubt on the scant direct evidence that we do have. The Myrna Stela, the David inscription, and many others that we've found. It appears that the minimalists are intent on undermining the text as reliable history. Instead, they propose what they think is a more objective way of reconstructing the history of Palestine, namely archaeology, ignoring the obvious hermeneutical and ideological problems inherent in that discipline. Until the last century, the Bible was acknowledged as the oldest historical document in the world. Even for those who might question its divine inspiration, it was the sole historical source for events which had happened before the Greek historians came on the scene. The Bible is still in this 20th century a historical source of respectable age, incorporating contemporary or nearly contemporary records of events which preceded the earliest Greek historians by 5 centuries or more. But it no longer stands alone, nor anywhere near the beginnings of history. The decipherment during the 19th century of documents written in the Egyptian, hieroglyphic, and Mesopotamian scripts pushed the frontiers of historical knowledge back to an age preceding the earliest chapters of the Bible by nearly 2,000 years. In the Mesopotamian writings, as our 20th century literature does to the books of the New Testament. Some problems and contradictions. It almost seems sacrilegious to start talking about problems within the text of the Bible, or the accuracy, or contradictions that may happen. But I believe that if we stick our head in the sand, then we give way to those that doubt and dispute our faith. Contradictions and problems turn out to be common in the Old Testament, starting at its very beginning. Some people go to great lengths to smooth over all these differences, but when you look at them closely, they are very difficult indeed to reconcile. And why should they be reconciled? Maybe they are simply differences. The creation account in Genesis 1 is very different from the account in Genesis 2. That's a staggering statement. Not only is the wording and writing style different, as is very obvious when you read the text in Hebrew, and not only did the two chapters use different names for God, but the very content of the chapters differs in numerous respects. Just make a list of everything that happens in chapter 1 in the order it occurs, and a separate list for chapter 2, and compare your list. Are animals created before humans as in chapter 1, or after as in chapter 2? Are plants created before humans or afterwards? Is man the first living creature to be created or the last? Is woman created at the same time as man or separately? Even within each story, there are problems. If light was created on the first day of creation in Genesis 1, how is it that the sun, moon, and stars were not created until the fourth day? Where was the light coming from, if not the sun, moon, and stars? And how could there be an evening and morning on each of the first 3 days if there was no sun? All these things are difficult to think about and are certainly not taught in most of our traditional Sunday school classes. That's just the beginning. When Noah takes the animals on the ark, does he take 7 pairs of all the clean animals as Genesis 7 chapter 2 states? Or does he take just 2 pairs as Genesis 7, 9 through 10 indicates? A close reading of the Bible reveals other problems beside the many discrepancies and contradictions. There are places where the text seems to embrace a view that seems unworthy of God or his people. Are we really to think of God as someone who orders the wholesale massacre of an entire city? In Joshua 6, God orders the soldiers of Israel to attack the city of Jericho and to slaughter every man, woman, and child in the city. I suppose it makes sense that God would not want bad influence on his people. But does he really think that murdering all of the toddlers and infants is necessary to that end? What do they have to do with wickedness? Some possible explanations and implications. It is commonly maintained that the Bible has one single unified voice, one biblical message. However, this is simply not true. The Old Testament, in fact, contains a collection of competing narratives written from opposing perspectives. Seeing the Old Testament from this perspective can be liberating. Rather than trying to make sense of and justify things that strike us as profoundly wrong, like genocide or slavery, we can instead see the Bible as a record of dispute, a witness to a struggle to understand who God is and who we are. Aren't we still doing that today? Those contradictions we find are then not problems to argue away, but simply due to the fact that the Hebrew Bible allows for diversity. It allows for the voices of competing sides to an issue to stand side by side within the canon. Because there are these divergent views, we are compelled to enter into that struggle too. The multiple conflicting views mean we must pick and choose as we read. The only question is, what do we pick and why? This is a view that you almost never hear in church. Most of the time, we Christians instead spend our time arguing that there are no contradictions in the Bible, attempting to harmonize the text. We have probably encountered the idea that there is a conflict between the Old and New Testaments. That one is a message of wrath, and the other is a message of love. Law versus love. Or perhaps we've heard that the Old Testament, when understood properly, in fact shows a concern for social justice and compassion for the poor. What we have not heard is that, in fact, both are true at the same time. The Old Testament contains messages of compassion and inclusion, and it contains messages of hate and harm, each claiming to speak for God. The relationship of the New Testament to the Old, then, is that it embraces one particular narrative in the Old Testament while critiquing it and rejecting another. Since the idea that the Old Testament contains multiple conflicting views is one that is unfamiliar to most church-going people. Here's an example of it. The concept of interracial marriage and what is the biblical view. In Ezra and Nehemiah, we see where Ezra declares that the idea is punishable by the sword and captivity. In Nehemiah, we see where the result of interracial marriage is to beat the men and pull out their hair. In Moses, we see where the result was to utterly destroy the men, women, and children of these foreign nations, killing everything that breathes. In Ruth, we see where Ruth meets Boaz and asks, "Why have I found favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz replies, "May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." The fact is, the Hebrew Bible does not present just one perspective, but instead presents us with differing perspectives, each claiming to represent God's own view. The fact that we find these competing perspectives side by side within the canon calls us to deliberate between the competing views, rather than spoon-feeding us a single answer. The multi-vocal nature of the Hebrew Bible calls to enter into a struggle ourselves, to make choices between right and wrong as moral adults. Next, we'll look at some textual analysis. The internal consistency. Despite being written over a span of about 4,000 years by over 40 different authors from diverse backgrounds, the Bible maintains a remarkable internal consistency. The narrative from Genesis to Revelation presents a coherent story about God's character and his redemptive plan for humanity. Even with the diversity of authors, cultures, and time periods, the Bible's central theme remains unchanged: God's love for humanity and his plan to save us through Jesus Christ. The text of the Bible is deeply important for the Christian faith, but difficult to hear the weight that it sometimes puts on them. Judaism has a more subtle approach to the Bible. While venerating it as much as many Christians do, it does not claim that everything in the religion is actually practiced is biblically derived and recognizes developments in new direction. Judaism thus has a holy book and a set of religious beliefs and practices, but the two are known not to correlate exactly, despite being perceived a congruent, and this may be a better model for understanding Christianity too than the common Protestant perspective of doctrine and practice is straightforwardly derived from the Bible, because it allows a space between the Bible and the religion. Thus, would in principle make it possible for the Bible to be heard on its own terms, and for religious faith to develop without being totally constrained by it. The relationship between the two needs negotiation. There comes a point in the Old Testament when the pilgrim is free to stop and take a long look around. He has had a well-marked path to follow, and still it stretches on ahead, but now it must relate to the world at large, to the scene spread out on every side, from her right at his feet to what is barely visible on the horizon, the dark riddle of how the world is governed and how it should be valued. There are many different theological views on this matter. The most important one for me is my faith in Jesus Christ and my personal relationship that I have with him. That does not keep me from wanting to study and know and to understand the historical accuracy of this great book that we've had for so many years.